Inside a cave in what is now Georgia, the country, not the state, archaeologists found something strange pressed into the walls. Residue. Ancient residue clinging to the inside of clay pots that had been sitting in the dark for almost 8,000 years. They ran the tests twice, because the first result seemed impossible. It was wine. Someone had made wine in this cave before the wheel existed, before writing existed, before anyone had figured out that you could put a roof on a building that wouldn't collapse in the rain. Someone looked at a pile of rotting grapes and thought, whatever is happening here, I want more of it. And that wasn't even close to the beginning. The story starts roughly 10,000 years ago, maybe longer. In what is now China, people were mixing rice, honey, and fruit in clay jars and leaving them to ferment. Not accidentally, deliberately. We know this because the jars were designed specifically for it, with narrow mouths that slowed oxidation and residue patterns that only appear when fermentation happens over multiple days. These people were not stumbling onto something. They were engineering it. Imagine being an ancient human and discovering that if you left certain foods alone long enough, they transformed into something that made you feel warm, brave, and significantly less worried about the mammoth situation. That is not a discovery. That is the ancient equivalent of finding a cheat code hidden inside reality itself. One of the earliest written records of alcohol appears in a Sumerian clay tablet from around 3000 BCE. It contains a recipe for beer, detailed instructions, specific ingredients, exact ratios. This tablet is one of the oldest written documents in human history, and it is a brewing manual. The very first thing humans decided was worth writing down was how to make beer. Let that settle for a second. From Mesopotamia, alcohol spread along every trade route humans had built. Merchants moving grain and gold were also moving fermentation knowledge. One of those routes ran directly through ancient Egypt, and that is where things got interesting. Egyptian workers building the pyramids were paid partly in beer, not as a bonus, as wages. The official daily ration for a pyramid worker was about 4 to 5 liters of beer per day. The most ambitious construction project in human history was powered by ancient labor. If that does not make you look at those structures differently, nothing will. Around the same period, across the Mediterranean in ancient Greece, a god was invented specifically around wine. Dionysus. Not a minor deity, not a footnote in the mythology, a full top-tier god with festivals, priests, temples, and rituals. The Greeks took wine so seriously that they had a whole theology built around the idea that intoxication was a form of divine contact. When you drank, you were not just relaxing, you were touching something sacred. Plato wrote about wine, Homer wrote about wine, the oracle at Delphi, through whom the gods allegedly spoke to mortals, functioned inside a culture absolutely saturated in fermented grapes. And it was not just the Greeks, because your body was already built for this before you ever tasted a drop. Your liver produces alcohol naturally in tiny amounts as a byproduct of digestion. You have enzymes specifically designed to process ethanol. The biological machinery was already there. Alcohol did not hijack your body. It slipped in through a door your body had quietly left unlocked for millions of years. Which explains why halfway across the world, in the highlands of Ethiopia, people were fermenting honey into tej, a kind of mead, so far back that its exact origins cannot be dated. Or why, in the Andes, people were making chicha from chewed corn before any European ship appeared on the horizon. Or why in Scandinavia, ancient Viking graves contained drinking horns and the residue of fermented barley. Every culture that found the process found a reason to keep it. In India, an ancient drink called sura appears in some of the oldest Sanskrit texts. Different versions of it were consumed at ceremonies, at weddings, and at funerals. The Rig Veda, one of the oldest religious texts in existence, contains references to a ritual drink called soma that made the drinker feel briefly invincible, briefly infinite, briefly closer to the gods than to the dirt. Nobody knows exactly what soma was. The debate has been running for centuries, but the feeling it described, that specific feeling of ordinary boundaries dissolving, sounds deeply familiar. Back in China, around 200 BCE, alcohol was already being used medically. Surgeons were mixing strong rice wine with herbal preparations to sedate patients before procedures. A physician named Bian Qi reportedly used wine-based preparations to manage pain during treatments that would otherwise be unbearable. The line between medicine and ceremony was not a line at all. It was a smudge. A deliberate, useful, culturally sanctioned smudge. And then there is the story that sounds completely invented but is not. In medieval Europe, monks became the primary keepers of brewing knowledge. Not as a sideline, as a sacred responsibility. Monasteries maintained breweries the way libraries maintained books. The monks believed that brewing was an act of stewardship, taking raw ingredients and, through patience and careful technique, producing something greater. They kept records. They refined processes. They experimented with hops when everyone else was still using mixtures of random herbs. When the Roman Empire collapsed and much of European civilization fragmented, the monasteries held the brewing knowledge together like archivists holding the last copies of something irreplaceable. By the time European colonizers arrived in the Americas, they carried alcohol with them the way other generations had carried seeds. It was simply part of the supply list. Practical, assumed, unremarkable. Except it was not unremarkable to the indigenous populations who had their own fermented traditions but encountered European distilled spirits for the first time. The difference between fermented beer and distilled whiskey is roughly the difference between a lit candle and a blowtorch. Both are fire. The scale is entirely different. And then came the reversal. In 1920, the United States made alcohol illegal. Not restricted, not taxed, illegal. Prohibition lasted 13 years and accomplished something remarkable. It made alcohol more available, more varied, more creatively produced, and significantly more dangerous than it had been before. Organized crime built entire empires on it. People died from badly distilled bootleg spirits. The government actually poisoned industrial alcohol to try to stop people from drinking it, and roughly 10,000 people died as a result. The cure was killing people faster than the disease. The man most associated with pushing prohibition forward was Wayne Wheeler, a lawyer and lobbyist who ran the Anti-Saloon League with the focused energy of someone who had discovered his life's purpose and the social awareness of someone who absolutely had not. Wheeler believed that alcohol was the cause of poverty, crime, and moral failure, a belief held with such certainty that contradicting evidence simply did not register. When Prohibition ended in 1933, nothing he had predicted had come true. Alcohol use had not been eliminated. Society had not been purified. The only measurable outcome was that criminals were now very, very wealthy. Years later, historians reviewing the internal documents of the Prohibition movement found something that recontextualized everything. The enforcement of Prohibition was applied wildly unequally. Working-class immigrant neighborhoods were raided constantly. Private clubs in wealthy districts where the same politicians who passed the laws were drinking quietly were left entirely alone. The law was not about alcohol. It was about who was allowed to enjoy things and who was not. That is not analysis. That is just reading the paperwork. Alcohol has been part of human life for at least 10,000 years. It has been legal for almost all of them. It has been illegal for a combined total of barely a century across all the cultures that tried banning it, and every single one of those bans either failed or ended. For virtually all of history, this process simply existed. You fermented grain in the morning and poured something into a horn at a funeral by evening. A group of monks decided that tending to the process was close to prayer. A civilization paid its pyramid builders in it. And that ancient winemaker in the Georgian cave, the one who pressed grapes into clay 8,000 years ago before writing existed, before wheels existed, before anyone had figured out how to build a roof that stayed up in the rain. That person did not know about policy debates or moral panics. They just knew that what happened inside that jar was worth doing again. And the people who came after them agreed, and kept agreeing, for 10,000 years without stopping. One last thing before you go. I hid a small golden coin somewhere in this video. First person to find it and tell me where in the comments wins a $20 gift card. Good luck.